Okay. I believe Sarah will be giving us a brief overview, some of the main points about the degrowth movement and sort of DANZ's position. DANZ stands for Degrowth Aotearoa New Zealand. And both Sahra and I have been founding members, but I think it was really Deirdre Kent who kind of pushed us along to do something. and Sarah's really been a stalwart in doing lots, with setting up Facebook and a high-low discussion piece, and entering lots of interesting documents and papers on the DANZ website, and making contacts really literally all over the world. So, and then there's a number of other people who were influential in establishing DANZ, including Mike Joy and Paul Bruce, I know is here, and here I think Locke joined us a bit later, and Nathan Surendran was also quite involved and extremely helpful. So I think most of that crew is likely to be here or show up shortly. So I think that's about enough of an introduction. Sarah, as I said, will speak for about 20 or 30 minutes, and then the purpose of this is to introduce the basics. If everyone would please ensure that they're muted, it would make things easier for everyone else to hear. Thank you. So again, the main point of this opportunity is really to allow those of you who have joined us to ask questions and raise issues, because degrowth is not a simple issue. It's complicated, it's even contradictory. And there's a lot of unknowns about, how do we actually do it? So feel free to chip in and offer your insights and comments and queries. So Sarah, over to you.
Right, I'll just screen share here. Jack, if you just let me
oh, right, I have to allow you to do that.
Thank you.
And I've just done that, so you should be able to screen share now.
Perfect. Yeah.
There you go. You're screen sharing.
Yeah, fantastic. So here we are. Ngā mihi mahana kia koutou, everyone. It's really lovely to have this opportunity, and just as I begin, I have this brief presentation which hopefully will be a helpful overview of our understanding of degrowth. But I always like to just start by acknowledging tangata whenua and te tiriti, and also the global impacts of colonization by imperial hyper-industrialized societies, and also to really make the point right from the beginning that degrowth thinking and degrowth sort of mindset is not new to Indigenous people. So what I'm going to talk about is just, I'll try and keep it as focused as possible. I recorded a podcast recently, and what I find is the challenge for me is to really focus on keeping myself limited, because there's so much to talk about. And even though some of these slides that are coming are probably with more words than I would normally, like, I just think that for those of us who find a visual anchor helpful, I have written out some of the key messages as well. The arc of my presentation, just to give you a little sense of direction, I'll give you a really brief introduction to my background, just so you know my position and where I am in my journey with degrowth. And then I'll look at definitions of degrowth, because sometimes it's, I think, really helpful to go right back to the basics of actually the definition of what we're talking about. Just a brief review of planetary limits and why this is so important, touching on the problems with green growth, and also addressing poverty. And then I'll talk most about our approach to degrowth and just what we've chipped away at to try and make it as simple and clear as possible. And finally, I'll just offer a brief description of our Resilient Communities project and describe that a bit further. And at the very end, maybe if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about our national conference in September. But there's more information about that on our website as well. So here we are. We'll start with the definitions of degrowth. And I think the main thing to really highlight is that there are multiple definitions. Some of them are quite lengthy and technical and hard to remember. And so what I've got here, just to walk us through, are the definitions that I use. Yorgos Kallis talks about degrowth referring to a radical political and economic reorganization leading to drastically smaller, much more equitably shared resources and energy use. So basically, degrowth is a purposeful strategic framework to reduce consumption and waste and achieve social and ecological goals. Another way of thinking about it is simply a managed reduction of energy and material throughput. So that's the movement of resources from nature through the economy and then dumped back into nature as waste. But one of the things that I just find so important to clarify right from the beginning, because in all of my discussions about degrowth, there seems to be a very common misunderstanding. And so I really always just highlight right from the beginning that degrowth is a planned process. It's a managed process. Unlike recession, which is chaotic and socially destabilizing and occurs when growth-dependent economies fail to grow. So this is a planned strategic thing, not a recession. Sometimes it's quite helpful, I think, to go back to real simple explanations. And for me, it's, in the kind of day-to-day conversations with my clients as a midwife, and the kind of on the street conversations when people ask you, oh, what's this degrowth thing you're into? What are you talking about? These are the simple explanations that I found to be really useful, actually, talking about an economy that doesn't cost the earth and that we need to live simply so that others may simply live, focusing on less stuff and more joy. And ultimately, it is an economy of enough, about quality and not quantity. So just briefly, I realized my background. I did want to just give you all, I sometimes forget, I know many of you, but for those of you who don't know me, I am a community midwife, and my involvement and thinking about limits to growth really stems from my time when I left school at the age of 14, because at that point I was really disillusioned with society and the kind of speed and acceleration and pressures that I was seeing all around me. And I had read some really significant books that impacted me that were talking about limits to growth. So I left school at 14 and lived by myself in a little cabin that I built in the Rocky Mountains of New Mexico, herding goats and making cheese and reading and reading and reading. And I also spent some time with an Amish community during that time that just really gave me the experience of living simply, and then choosing to enter the society and this kind of modern world, but with the work as a midwife, working with transition states, and really the very, very meaningful time of welcoming a new baby in a way that could be safe, but also using appropriate use of interventions and not the kind of medicalized industrial process that a lot of obstetrics sees nowadays. So I came to New Zealand to do my study here, and then I worked in the Pacific, PNG, and Vanuatu and Solomons, and did a big international research study there. And ultimately, in 2019, realized that I need to work locally here, largely because of the impact of flying and aviation, and just being very upset at my own contribution with these flights that I was doing, and seeing firsthand the villages that were having water lapping at their doorsteps, really, and also the white coral, knowing that the ocean is heating and the coral is dying there. So that brought me to work here with a focus on local change, and finding this group of like-minded activists and people advocating for a degrowth mindset, and the kind of societal changes that we desperately need has been a really good fit for me. So that's just a little personal background for those of you who are wondering who I am. In terms of the urgency, and this is what we come back to time and again, is the science, and realizing that there's such a focus on climate change in our wider discourse, but that's in for many of us, that's now considered sort of tunnel vision, that what we are really facing is multiple systems collapse, and that even though this is a common diagram, I feel like it's probably not as well understood as I assume. And when we really look at it, the orange sections indicate overshoot of planetary boundaries. Green sections indicate safe state within the boundaries, but that really we're looking at multiple thresholds and tipping points: climate change, ocean acidification, stratospheric ozone depletion, biogeochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus, global freshwater use, land system change, loss of biological diversity. That's one of the ones that really impacts me, and just real heartbreak, seeing the loss of species, and the species that are being threatened and suffering too. We watched a documentary recently about planetary boundaries from David Attenborough, and it's just heartbreaking to see the footage so directly, and the destruction that is being wreaked on this beautiful planet. So yeah, I think that's the foundation of much of our thinking, is just the urgency, the speed of this crisis, and the scope and the scale. And I suppose for me personally, there's also this other side of it, which is we talk about emissions a lot, but Professor Vaclav Smil's 4 pillars of modern civilization, he mentions cement, steel, plastics, and ammonia, fertilizers. And those 4 pillars of our civilization are all reliant on fossil fuels. So the crisis is really, it's really quite overwhelming. So green growth is what is being offered currently as the kind of solution to these problems, and electrifying everything, and kind of having a greener approach to our lifestyle. I really think for many of us, we've become aware that green growth is anything but green, and it's really misnamed. It's technology growth, and it relies on mining, and so will wreak untold environmental and social harms. The analogy that's really useful for me, I think, is this idea of electrifying the Titanic. We're full speed ahead, and if we electrify the Titanic, it really does nothing for the multiple icebergs all around us. And GDP growth, GDP increase in ecological harm are really closely matched. And so if we continue to grow, even if it's green growth, it will really make things worse. And then there's other challenges as well, like energy descent, but I'm not going to get into that tonight. There's the other issue of tackling poverty. And, you know, people often ask me, isn't growth needed to fight poverty? Isn't growth necessary for reducing inequalities? Well, the evidence is really that policy matters more than growth. And a more even distribution would mean a happier, healthier, and safer country. If we had higher taxes on wealth, we would invest in the shared public goods that benefit not just the poor, but everyone in the middle too. So just with respect to the name, this is often a very uncomfortable part of the whole thing for people in the beginning. People are very confronted and taken aback by this kind of name degrowth, and yet it provides an opportunity to discuss the deliberate and confronting nature of the name. It is a critique of physical and material growth and quantitative expansion. And we all have seen how, you know, growthism is kind of a fundamentalist belief system now. And for many people, it's become easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of growth. And this is an article that Deirdre wrote at the very beginning last year. The title of the article is "The Word to Hate and Then Accept." And I think it's just so apt and really is a great description of how we feel. It's confronting in the beginning, but the more you think about the power of the name, you realize that actually it's a great way of starting conversations. So yeah, the argument for degrowth is that we need to abandon the ideology of the constant pursuit of economic growth as something that is good, desirable, necessary, and natural, because it is none of these things. And if we really want to stay within planetary limits that make sense, we need to change and transform our economy and how we organize our lives. So it's about working out a when to stop rule together based on parameters of sufficiency within biophysical limits. And it's about intergenerational justice, wealth redistribution, and about reestablishing our relationship to the living world and rebuilding a culture of care. And it's, you know, it's, when I talk about degrowth with people, even before I kind of get into the detail, it's encouraging to me how many people just say, yeah, it makes sense. So when we look at the response to our multiple problems nowadays, scaling down, slowing down actually just makes sense. So degrowth is a very, very broad movement. The modern version is about 20 years old, arising out of Europe. The movement is so big and complex, as Jack mentioned before, that there are contradictions and variations, and it is in a continual process of emerging clarity. And what I've come to realize really is that, like most things, it's a continuum. You know, on one side, there's kind of a business orientation towards degrowth and some degrowth-like changes to the structures that we have. And on the other side of the continuum is a sort of disaster preparedness and awareness of, you know, potential collapse. So what we need to do is we need to work out what needs to be done and then how. And what I'll describe now is our approach. Again, emphasizing that our version is based on empirical evidence and science, and really focused on the enormity of the crisis that we're facing. So our approach, we've really narrowed it down to 3 main goals, which I will describe in more depth shortly. And I'll also describe some priority actions that we have. And these goals are really, I guess they're based on a sort of proactive approach instead of the usual reactive approach, the typical ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. Because we are accepting that energy descent and economic disruption is inevitable. So the first point is, the first goal is a managed reduction of material and energy throughput. Again, just to clarify, throughput is the resources and energy that go into the economy for that economic activity and growth, or the use that we have for these materials and energy, and then what gets dumped out on the other side is waste back into the environment. So we definitely and desperately need a managed reduction of throughput, because we are currently about double where we need to be, and rationing fossil fuels is the single most important action. Also, there's focus on, restricting advertising and luxury goods, things like the hypermobility of luxury travel, but also banning destructive substances like artificial fertilizers and forever chemicals. And this will, likely lead to a reduction in GDP. So clearly there need to be supports in place, which is our second goal. To focus on providing supports for basic human needs that need to be prioritized: shelter, food, water, sanitation, access to community networks, basic services, health, housing, food, education, transport, universal basic income, reduced work time, and guaranteed work. So those are the supports that will need to be in place at a community level to protect against the sort of disruptions that are coming. But also we really need to emphasize that there needs to be support for non-material needs. Certainly the security of identity and agency and connectedness. The third goal is that we need to focus on systemic changes to support the transition to a steady state economy. So for example, the rationing of fossil fuels, as I mentioned before, is the only certain way of controlling emissions. And we have a petition for tradable energy quotas. There's more information on our website about tradable energy quotas, and perhaps we could do another webinar another time to dive into that further, because there's just not time tonight. But other examples are, taxing resources instead of labor, and certainly redistribution and minimum maximum incomes, focusing on community resilience. And by resilience, we mean simplification and really the core priorities that we need to be focusing on. Using citizens' assemblies for democratic decision-making, focusing on local government, which is more connected to communities and more agile. And ultimately transitioning from a debt-based money system, which of course depends on growth. So some of the priority actions that we've identified is, we need to prioritize what we use in the economy for essential needs, and make sure that basic human needs are met at the community level. And that of course includes health services, food security, water, shelter, and building networks. Community actions have political implications. People then are far more likely to push politicians for the change that they recognize as needed. And we need to focus on quality improvement, and that ultimately reducing throughput and focusing on improving quality will impact life satisfaction too. Non-material needs will include things like having more time and the ability to focus on relationships and creativity, tasks, and having a voice and a strong identity. So, you know, focusing on other ways of being together, intimacy, joy, creativity, playfulness, doing things together, sharing. We are social beings, and so we gain enormous satisfaction from connection. And I think degrowth, and certainly our understanding, really emphasizes the benefits as well as the need for reductions. So yeah, we recognize that there is a gap between what is politically feasible. For instance, the Greens' wealth tax policy proposal and rail and the infrastructure improvements that will strengthen resilience nationally. And yeah, there's also what is absolutely necessary, but we recognize is not politically feasible, such as fossil fuel rationing. And I guess the key point here is to note that citizen activism is needed outside the political sphere to bring more issues into the realm of possibilities. So it is up to us to keep pushing and encouraging what hopefully at some point will become politically feasible. So just a little bit more detail about our Resilient Communities project. This is a project that we would like to develop to support and promote the development of resilient communities across New Zealand. And the idea is to develop a framework for resilient communities based on universal basic needs, to identify community level activities and resources which promote and provide resilience, obtain funding to do this, and develop and support a team of resilient community development specialists to travel the country and establish local groups to build community resilience. And seeing as it's only 7:30 and I've managed to keep myself as constrained as I hoped, I'm going to give you a little bit more information about this, just because I think it's really exciting, and I think it's really important that we discuss some of the strategies of how we might implement some action towards actually implementing degrowth and the sort of community projects that we think are really important to get on with, irregardless of top-down policy stuff. So this project would be built on the premise that the more locally these basic resources are distributed, the more useful they will be when a disaster hits. Affected communities will be better able to meet their own needs, and neighboring communities will be able to provide support as well. So again, just reminding you that our focus is very much on universal basic needs, housing and food security, and those really basic human necessities. The recent intense weather events in the North Island, and I think some of them are still ongoing now with the latest rain up in Tairāwhiti, have made it really clear that many communities are left to their own devices because government resources are overwhelmed by the scale of disruption. And the interesting thing about a basic human needs approach to resilient communities is that these local resources are extremely useful even when disasters have not occurred. So ensuring that everyone has adequate local nutritious food, shelter, water, and so on may not seem innovative and aspirational. But the fact is that many New Zealanders do not have these basic needs adequately met, and their lives would be significantly improved if they did. And everyone needs to understand the increasing importance of ensuring these basic resources and services. And the recent pandemic certainly highlighted that for many of us. Another important aspect of this approach is that it builds community. whether it involves growing food together, helping to insulate cold houses, car and ride sharing, or any of the many other aspects of developing resilient communities. It involves people connecting locally and engaging in common projects and towards a common cause. There are, of course, many groups throughout the country who are already engaged in some aspect of such a movement. Such groups could become hubs around which more comprehensive resources and services could be made available in each community. Part of this project's task would be to connect these groups and provide support to enhance their outreach and effectiveness. We suspect that funding for such an initiative could be obtained from various government resources available for climate adaptation and/or emergency management planning. But funding will require a sound proposal with specific budget and identifiable outcomes. So this is a call out to members and beyond who feel they could contribute in some way to this project. So in summary, we need to work out a when to stop rule together. Life satisfaction is based on non-material things. That should be our goal. We can embrace change, and we need to focus on care and establish systems that comprehensively and equitably care for everyone for the duration of any hardships. We need to work together. And here's a little graphic that I found really useful in some of the other talks that I've done that just describes how we are in this growth economy, which is just ramping up, pedal to the metal, despite all the crises around us, you know, the fires in Canada right now and the floods, and we are still in this growth economy. So what we need is a degrowth economy. And once we have worked out the sort of when to stop rule and contracted somewhat, then we're aiming for a post-growth economy, or a steady state economy is another word for that. So degrowth and post-growth are sometimes conflated, but there is a different, and I think that distinction is helpful. And there's references there. Okay, Jack, back over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. So here's an opportunity to ask questions, make comments. And if you could indicate your interest in doing so, it would be very helpful if you use the little icon, the hand raising. And then it's very easy to spot those of you that would like to make some comments or ask a question. And okay, Paul, go ahead. You're on mute.
Yeah, actually, I wasn't intending to ask a question at the moment, but I saw that Manu Kari had, he was wanting to ask a question. Do you want to go to him at this moment?
I'm sorry, there's someone else that wants to ask a question.
Manu Kari.
I don't see where they are, but if
It's in the chat.
oh, you're in the bath. Okay.
That's funny, Manu. Love it. It's a great sense of playfulness. Can you ask us your question from the bath? You don't need to turn
Okay, I
your
see.
video
All right, I've now got the chat that is there a balance between reducing reliance on new technology and still encouraging human creativity, innovation, and invention, and new technologies like medicine, medical services, etc., that improve the quality and duration of life for everyone, including non-human life? So Sarah, would you like to address that?
I was actually just distracted momentarily, Jack. I think I'll just pass that one back to you briefly.
Sorry, say again?
I was just going to pass that one back to you, Jack, because I was actually momentarily distracted, so I didn't hear the beginning of the question.
Oh, well, let me repeat the question just so because others may not have heard it properly. It says, is there a balance between reducing reliance on new tech and still encouraging human creativity, innovation, invention, and so on?
Yeah, I think human creativity and innovation is what I would consider an absolutely essential aspect of being human, and one of those kind of non-material needs. And I think within a recognition that energy and material use needs to be limited, I think using our imaginations and our creativity for problem solving in our collective crisis is absolutely essential.
Yeah, I think part of the issue is what we use our creativity and innovation for. If we're using it to ensure that everyone's basic needs are fairly met, that's quite a different goal than using our creativity and technology for profit. Right now, there's a lot of creativity going into electrifying everything. There was an interesting video I watched recently by a chap who has organized the, what does he call it? It's the, it's a study of the Low Tech magazine. And his talk was about de-electrifying everything. And he gave many historical examples of how we used to do things without electricity. So life is possible without, electricity, or at least as much electricity as we currently consume. There's a second part to this question that I think is also quite interesting, which I'll read. It's who or what mechanism, other than the market and government, decides what is appropriate, acceptable activity and what doesn't fit with a communal commitment to degrowth. Sarah, did you hear that one?
I did, yeah.
Can you actually see the question in the chat?
Who or what mechanism, other than the market and government, decides what appropriate, acceptable activity and what doesn't fit with a communal commitment to degrowth? Well, I think, this is personally, I'm kind of understanding this question to be related to something like a citizens' assembly. So, currently there is the kind of decision makers top-down strategy around approach to what is appropriate and acceptable. But I think, there's other ways of representing collective priorities. Jack, what are your responses to that?
Yeah, well, I would just reinforce what you've just said. So many of our priorities are set by the market. They're set by corporations or by governments influenced by the corporate sector. And the Citizens Assembly, I agree, would be a wonderful mechanism for bringing more democracy to decisions about what our priorities should be.
Yeah.
Just what sort of luxuries, if any, can we manage and still stay within planetary boundaries? And how do they get fairly distributed? Is it totally on the basis of wealth, or is there another value that we want to ensure, that things are equitably distributed?
Yeah, there's another question about Rod Orum's recent degrowth presentation, which I think confused many of us, actually, and was part of the inspiration for doing a follow-up overview of the actual degrowth movement, because what he was describing as symbiosis was quite related, I think. I think he was talking about much more harmony with nature and nature-based solutions, and so my sense and my answer to that question would be that I think he was advocating for many similar things. Perhaps he didn't like the name of degrowth. That was part of my personal impression, was that he was looking for a name that was perhaps a bit more palatable, and symbiosis is a representation, I think, of the balance between human needs and the environment. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, Pat, you have a question or like to make a comment?
I'd like to make a comment. I'd like to pass on a comment that I came across in a book called Lean Logic by David Fleming. It's a huge fat book, and I'm sure many of you are familiar, maybe more so than I am. And he who gave us the tradable energy quota system, which I'm really pleased to hear promoted tonight. We are all doing our best really to promote that. But David Fleming, I read his section on degrowth, and I think I'm remembering him correctly. He says that degrowth will be thrust upon us inevitably when the climacteric approaches or arrives. And you can, we who are aware can see signs of what he might be describing or calling it the climacteric, as the universities are being downgraded. We've had all kinds of economic problems, and inequality is getting worse and worse, and nothing seems to happen. Is this the path towards what David Fleming is describing? I wonder how else really can we get a government to get rid of GDP and work towards what we all want. Anyway, it's just, that was just his comment that I'd like to pass on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pat. And I love David Fleming's work. I've got his book as well, and I think it's really, he's a very, very clear thinker. And I guess what strikes me with your comment as well is that Mike Joy talks about degrowth as either managed or forced upon us. And for those of us who are advocating for a managed degrowth process, we think there's enormous value in planning this as best we can, even if it's not politically feasible at the moment. The more we can strengthen our approach and provide a sort of blueprint, the better, knowing that at some point we'll probably need to be focusing on sufficiency and local resources, less dependence on the global supply chains, and I often talk about time horizons. At the moment, the electoral cycle is looking at 3 years, 10 years down the track. Part of what has really driven me into the action that I'm involved with now is that with every birth that I attend, I'm thinking about the future of that child. So my time horizon is a lot further, and I'm really concerned about what these children who are being born now are going to be facing when they're adults.
Yeah, I think that's very relevant. Because of the brevity of time that we've had, Sarah wasn't able to go into much depth on the first goal of the degrowth as we see it, and that is reducing throughput, energy, material throughput. But there's evidence from a variety of very different kinds of studies, whether it's planetary boundaries or ecological footprint or primary production or just gross material consumption. The data are very clear. We have the only planet we're aware of with a biosphere, and we kind of take that for granted. But that biosphere is made up of hundreds of subsystems, whether it's a climate system or a water system or a geochemical exchange systems. And all of those evolved together, and they produced life and complex life. And we are utterly dependent on all of those complex systems. And yet, what we've done with the expansion of the human enterprise is disrupt the very basic functions of those systems, their ability to reproduce and their ability to recycle waste. You know, if you think about any living organism, those are the two most fundamental functions that a living organism can do. And we've disrupted nature's ability to do that. And we're doing it at a rate where the risk is irreversible changes to that system. And that's really what we're headed for, and why we see that degrowth is so urgent, you know, to reduce that material throughput, and why reducing fossil fuels would be the single most important thing we could do politically and practically, because not only would reduce emissions in terms of climate, but without all that fossil energy, it would not be possible to move mountains and destroy forests and, you know, build airports and more cities and so on. That's what's disrupting these natural systems. So, excuse me, reducing fossil fuels would be an enormous first step. And it would also be very disruptive, as Sarah's pointed out. And that's why all the supports need to be in place. And the supports are things we can do now. They're more politically feasible and acceptable. So that's part of, again, why we have taken the particular approach. Bruce, you had your hand up there. Paul, I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm just fixing on that word you said, disruption. We actually need disruption to get creativity. At the present time, we're flooded with consumer goods. So it's very hard to, you know, use your mind or be with a group of friends and talk deliberatively about creative solutions, because there's always a consumer item. But rationing, not just fossil fuels, but of consumer goods coming in, reducing the advertising will actually lead to people being more creative, more localization, spending time with your friends and communities and talking about potential shortages and ideas to deal with that locally, not through imported goods. And that it's going to be very, very hard to change until we have some restrictions.
Yeah, I agree with you, Paul. And I guess, you know, what we're trying to do tonight is to talk about, you know, the things that we can do. And I guess one of the things that I'm most passionate about is, you know, having these conversations and really doing everything we can to influence the collective mindset. And I think that disruptions will be helpful for that too. You know, more and more we are being confronted by limits to growth and environmental ecological destruction. And so the more we can talk about this and emphasize the urgency and the need to fundamentally change the paradigm that we are living in, the ways that the values that we have, the priorities that we make, a lot of that I think needs to be done from a position of understanding, and so just talking about degrowth and helping people understand, you know, that the solutions that we have currently are actually, they're not going to help. In fact, they may make things worse. They will make things worse. We need to fundamentally take responsibility and slow things down. Pat, did you have another question? I just think you've been patiently waiting.
My apologies. I don't have another question.
Okay, thank you.
I'm happy listening.
Becky, as they end up there, you unmute yourself. There you go.
Yeah, I just had a comment. This is great, and I'm so excited that something like this is actually happening. I didn't expect this. and I think we're all on the same page here. I think that all the degrowth program, I'm sure most of you have read the book on degrowth. I get to the bottom at the end of all these books, and I ask the question that young people used to ask me all the time, well, what do we do? And that's the tough one. Okay, I think these are good, and us spreading the word is good, and engaging even the other side in arguments. I think that's all essential. But I do think that there's really, I mean, this is a crisis, and we don't have much time left here to deal with this crisis, unfortunately. And the thing that I think is actually the first step has just been proposed, and that was a shock to me too. And that was the Green Party's program to tax the wealthy, and then to provide other aspects of this kind of degrowth program. And I think that is, I immediately contributed to the Green Party when I saw that, because the books all lead you to that conclusion. It's the environment and it's inequality. Neither of those can be solved alone. The inequality situation is such that 1% has all the wealth, all the income, and therefore all the power. And we've got to find a way to break that hold. And this fair taxation is an obvious first step. It's not the final step, but somehow we've got to get some wealth into our side, because everything we're talking about here is going to take wealth. I mean, we already are strapped in this country for support, for healthcare, for education, for infrastructure. All of these already are lacking funding, okay? Inflation is taking away more of our resources. But anyhow, I just want to put that out there, that my conclusion is that we've got to find a political avenue to get resources available to try to directly solve these problems. That's about all.
Yep. I'm so grateful for your comments, and you know, we just couldn't agree more that, you know, shifting away from the pursuit of perpetual growth towards redistribution, you know, and more equitable distribution of resources is just critical, and seems so necessary and logical to us. And yet, you know, we are so stuck, and the need to work politically is certainly incredibly important.
Well, yeah, the one more comment on that. I think that the heart of degrowth is really justice, and that means social justice. We know what all that is. It's about discrimination, blah, blah, blah. Economic justice, and that's this fairness of distribution of wealth. And this environmental justice. That's really what our philosophy is based on, those three elements of justice. And I like to keep that in mind, because that guides me.
Yeah, absolutely important. And also, just, you know, going back to science and empirical evidence, you know, if we don't learn to live within biophysical limits, nothing else matters. So we must prioritize that and do it in a just way. You know, this is the absolute priority that we need to be advocating for. Jim, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, the elephant in the room seems to be, as is often the case to me anyway, human population size. Our biomass is far too big. You didn't mention it.
We can talk about that at length if you like. We have a very clear position statement on population, which is on our website. And I am more than happy to talk about it also from my position as a midwife. My research was based on access to contraception, and we recognize the powers of pronatalism that are actually pushing for an increase in population in many countries. And so we are very strongly based on the principle of reproductive justice, which means that couples need to have the full agency to choose how many children they have and when, and to be able to raise their children in safe communities. So absolutely, population is, it's part of the science, but we have the people that we have now, and so we need to really be very careful about thinking again from a justice lens, empowering people to make those decisions for when they're ready to have a child, and to avoid unwanted pregnancies.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment on that if I might as well. 'Cause I think it is a very critical, important issue that Jim has raised. If we think of biophysical limits, that we have to somehow learn to live within our limits, those biophysical limits are relatively fixed. They can change over longer periods of time, but any particular time they're relatively fixed. So that's what we have to learn to share. And how we share that, hopefully equitably, then it's a function of how much of that we each get to share, how big our piece of the pie is, and how many people are eating the pie. So it's both per capita consumption and the number of people consuming that determines whether we're in ecological overshoot or not, or whether we're actually living within those planetary boundaries. And and what that balance is between per capita consumption and population is now left to the market. And that's part of the problem, because one of the easiest ways to grow an economy is simply to have more people. But if we're going to strike a balance that's just and equitable as well as sustainable, then we're going to have to do something like a citizens' assembly to work out where that balance is. And every nation may come up with a different solution. But population is certainly one of the big factors. I would agree. I want to also, if I may, comment on a question I thought Becky raised, and that is, what do we do? And I think Sarah has outlined a number of things that we can do, some of which are more politically feasible than others. One is to support the petition for rationing fossil fuels, which would lead to a decrease in all kinds of consumables. It would be a gradual decrease over time, over a short number of years. That's one important thing that's not really politically feasible yet, but the more of you that ask for it, and the more of you that tell your friends and neighbors and colleagues about it and how important it is, that'll push it toward more political feasibility. Supporting the kind of wealth tax that the Green Party is currently proposed, and I'm not even a party member, so this isn't a party issue. DANZ is apolitical, but those kinds of tax measures help to provide the sort of supports that are going to be needed for the disruption that Paul's talking about. We need to need to be disruptive. And then there's also the issue that Sarah outlined about building community resilience. That's something we can all do within our communities. And I'll stop and give the others a chance here. Dave, I think you had your hand up next, if you would unmute yourself.
Yeah, kia ora, everyone. Really interesting discussion, and I'm really enjoying being part of this. I will say that I'm Dave Kennedy. I live in Invercargill, and I'm actually going to be Green Party candidate for the Southland electorate. And one of the things that promoted me into or convinced me to join the Green Party was the appropriate decision-making element of the party's principles. And I kind of think the way we promote decision-making at government level probably could do with some rethinking. I know in the past some governments have looked at, talked about cost-benefit analysis for any decision they make in terms of investments, but they often create their own priorities for what cost-benefit analysis involves. And I kind of think if we can shift the process of decision-making to something that's more responsible, then you don't have to have a lot of detailed policies. You just have to have really sound decision-making processes. So if you have cost-benefit analysis that looks at not short-term gain, but long-term gain, so what's going to be the 10, 20, 30-year impact of that decision? What are the environmental consequences of that decision? What are the social consequences of that decision? What will be involved in any investment? Like we know that, for instance, child poverty costs the country something like $3 billion a year, and yet we're not prepared to invest a few million to deal with it. So many things. I think if we had transparent cost-benefit analysis, the national government at one point had their roads of national significance policy, and they had all these motorways they built, and they actually failed standard cost-benefit analysis. They for every dollar that was invested, they didn't make more than $1 in terms of return. So they changed the process. I think there's been articles and research done to mean that government priorities were a large element of the cost-benefit analysis. So it was important to the government. It became an extra weighting. So why shouldn't we include with any decision and any spending, what's going to be the environmental impact, what's going to be the social impact, and what's going to be the impact over the next 2 generations? And if governments have to present their decisions based on those sort of criteria, it'll be kind of transparent, and people will see whether it's a short-term gain or a long-term gain, or whether it's just purely political to suit whoever are funding their campaigns. So I would really promote the idea of, let's look at the decision-making process at government level. What are the criteria that should be used, and let's make it transparent.
I love that, Dave. Thank you so much. And I absolutely and passionately in agreement. The parameters that I'm really interested in, I guess, from my medical position too, is the concept of risk management. In obstetrics, I say this all the time. Our risk tolerance is extremely low. If anybody has an adverse outcome, we get shamed and blamed and potentially struck off the register. And yet, the risk management for the future children as they grow is appallingly missing. And what would it be like if we had a cross-government governing sort of structure around concepts of sufficiency? What would that look like? So, yeah, Dot, why don't you ask your question, unmute yourself, and at the end I'll still talk about our conference briefly, but I'm really enjoying your questions, so we'd love to hear from you, Dot.
Hi everybody, this is the first time I've been on one of your Zooms. I'm also a member of the Green Party, and my time seems to get taken up with their stuff. But yesterday I went to the launch of something called Tapatahi, which is a coalition for a people with Aotearoa, and it came out of a group who started to look at degrowth and decided that they really needed to tackle this sort of capitalist system and work with a whole lot of groups who are looking at capitalism and how to get rid of it, basically. So I just wondered how much, like just looking at your list of people on the Zoom tonight, I know of very few people, but how important is it to you to help people link up with each other across the country? and to make available sort of, links and sort of ways we can join together and discuss these things. I mean, I'm really interested and exciting in the ideas that have come up tonight. They're very similar to the ideas that were put forward yesterday. We listened to Sue Bradford and Mike Joy and a couple of other people whose names I didn't catch, John Minto. And their main aims are very much like the similar aims as what you've put out today. So, yeah, I'm just sort of thinking, you talked at the start about, linking communities and working together and things. So that seems to me something we can start doing straight away. We don't have to wait for government permission to do that. We can just start building communities and of similar-minded people, even if we're hundreds of miles apart. So it's not really a question, sorry.
I'd love to respond. Thank you so much, Dot, because actually we are part of their alliance. So Tapatahi is a fantastic initiative, really looking at linking up like-minded organizations, and Mike Joy was there on our behalf. He's a part of our core group, and we're in contact and completely supportive. And I think, part of the raising awareness and joining up, collaborating, that's absolutely what we are pushing for. We may all have slightly different emphases, but we are certainly pushing for the same goals and working in our own ways, but we are an alliance.
Yeah, the other thing I would add to that is, again, going back to Sarah's comment about building resilient communities. That's something that we need to do with respect to climate adaptation. It's something we need to do from a disaster management perspective. It's something we need to do from a justice perspective in terms of equitable distribution of the abundance that we have. So there's lots of reasons to do it. It's also something that could be done, that has to be done really at the local level, at the community level. And it ensures that basic needs can be met, whether there's a disaster or not. And it's things that people can do. We don't have to wait for government to do these things, which I think is really important. But it also does something else that builds community. And by focusing on those basic needs and building community, people get to see and feel the benefits of working together on worthy causes. And if government and politicians can see that people are interested in that, then the politicians will eventually follow. Now that's a long process, but at the very least, it makes communities more secure in terms of meeting basic needs, because as Sarah mentioned, degrowth is happening already, and it's going to accelerate. And if we don't prepare for it and plan for it and manage it in some way, it'll be much more difficult. So better to try to encourage a planned approach.
And I would add to that, Jack, that we have good examples. The communities up in Tairāwhiti, they are providing examples. They have their marae, they have their connections and their local networks. And, we need to really be thinking about, relying on the people that are around us, these smaller communities where we have relationships, where we know each other. And I think, being able to learn from communities who have been in the thick of it and who have done it well, who have actually leaned on each other. And, I find it quite inspiring that even on national radio this morning, they were talking about the benefits that people have found by, really strengthening their community bonds and their collective, going away from the kind of hyper individualism towards a collective focus on well-being and support. We have case examples of that. And I think if that can be replicated, that's something that we really need to be prioritizing nationally. So just being mindful of the time, if there's more questions, please raise your hands. But I'll just take a moment to talk about our event in September, which we're very excited about. And this is a national conference or workshop. We weren't quite sure what to call it. So we've just ended up calling it an event. And it's really an opportunity to bring people together. As you say, Dot, you know, a lot of the challenges that we are all so dispersed and we're all working in slightly different ways, but we don't know necessarily what the others are doing. And so this is a event where we are hoping that people will come together, and we've called it Beyond Growth Aotearoa. So it's looking at the benefits of planned degrowth. And on the weekend of the 16th and 17th of September, we'll be at Victoria University in Wellington. And the first day, Saturday, we'll have a presentation, a recorded presentation from Nate Higgins, who many of you may know from his podcast, The Great Simplification. And I would just put a little flag there. If you're not familiar with The Great Simplification, really encourage you to check it out. It's a great description of our situation and also the responses that are being offered internationally to work with the crises, the multiple crises that are unfolding. So Nate Higgins will join us in the morning, and then we have a speaker from Barcelona, from the Degrowth headquarters in Europe. And then we have a session really just looking at Te Ao Māori and degrowth and the interface there, and what we have to learn, and what we share, and how we can collaborate more closely. In the afternoon, we have a panel discussing how to mainstream the movement further. So we're hoping to have a representation from journalism and government, some of the sort of decision makers perhaps, who can share their views on how we can bring these concepts into more of a mainstream awareness. And in the afternoon after that, we have a panel looking at enabling the transition. So kind of cross-governance strategies for finding mechanisms with, you know, a focus on more long-term thinking. And you know, we're really focusing on sufficiency as a concept that might be a very useful one. Saturday evening, we'll have a bit of open time for people to hang out and network and just share time together. And then on day two, we're moving away from the kind of systemic discussions towards the real on the ground, bottom up community response. So we'll spend a bit of time in the morning talking about our Resilient Communities project, hopefully, and then looking at things like you know, local community actions, maybe some stalls for people to move around to talk about community gardens and food security, you know, tool libraries, repair cafes. There's so many good community initiatives, and it's an opportunity for us to learn from one another and really strengthen those kind of bottom-up actions that are already happening. And we'll hope to end the day with a joint interactive session considering the psychological and the emotional aspect. So moving from kind of the macro perspective right down to the micro, and how this impacts on us individually and our relationship to ourselves, and of course, relationship to each other, and also the relationship to nature, and how our emotional processes, especially those of us who have gone through the whole cycle of grief, you know, from bargaining and anger and then that point of grief, and coming to a place of acceptance and finding agency in that, and really connection, I think that is essential for moving forward and shifting towards a focus on collective well-being, moving away from the individual towards a sense of collective well-being, and how we can do that within ecological limits and our beautiful natural environment where we live. So come and join us if you're interested. Wellington, 16th, 17th of September. There'll be lots more information coming as it takes shape. We're putting it all onto our website. Our website is quite extensive now, so there's a lot of resources there. And this is all, you know, I think I always like to just acknowledge that this is a work in progress. We haven't got all the answers. We are working it out together. We know what is, you know, the science is telling us what is necessary. But the way forward is something that we really need to work out together. Rawson, did you have a comment you'd like to make? Just please remember to unmute yourself.
Evening, everybody. I find this with some rather interest because I've been heavily involved in other economic ones in the Amazon and indigenous tribes in the Amazon and also in Russia. Certainly studying all the different types of economies, the circular Kate's one around the donut, the inverse of the donut as well, that's out there, the takarangi method as well, which is inverses the well-being process of it. But one of the things is that when I saw it come on my email, I said I didn't understand what degrowth means. So I've got a bit of insight into that. But what I'm really looking for is some examples of where this is close to working, even 50% or 100% a part of this continuum that we're looking for the ideal state, where that is. And Sarah, you've mentioned some of the communities in Tairāwhiti as some of those examples, and I'm part of Tairāwhiti. I actually live in Whangarei, but I'm a farm supervisor on 1,600 hectares down in the East Coast. And, you know, we've had this flooding problem, and it's about looking at the resilience of our community and what all that means. We've done the same work here for farmers in the Northland around resilience as well. So I appreciate what everybody's put up, and I'm really keen to see where this is going to go. But what I'm really looking for is other examples I can copy and utilise in my own community. I'm a bit of a doer rather than talk a lot about it. So I want to get some models and try and implant it in my community. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Join our Resilient Communities project.
Okay, send me an email. I'm in the system.
Yeah, and I would even, I mean, I would go a bit further, Ross, and I have to say that, you know, my experience working in the villages of the Solomon Islands in particular, they actually, you know, they have technology and in some, you know, limited means, they have sanitation and access to fresh waters, and they're happy people. They've got an extraordinary sense of community spirit and playfulness and that kind of collective identity. And they're really, I mean, of course, every group of people have got their challenges, and yet I think, you know, we can look around and find examples. I have no doubt that there is inspiration that can guide us for these things. And, you know, I always come back to the kind of basics in this conversation, which is it's all about what we prioritize. And if we really identify, you know, quality, what is it that leads to life satisfaction? You know, all of us have those moments in our life where we know that feeling of deep satisfaction. And I can almost guarantee that for most of us, that's not about material things. It's not about stuff that we've bought. It's about relationships. It's about tasks that we've completed that have contributed to, you know, someone else's well-being. So focusing on, you know, what is the meaning of our lives? And yes, we need food security. We need, you know, those basic existential needs, But we also need to really rethink what our priorities are in terms of how we live. And slowing down, I think, is part of that.
I got a story told to me the other day about in New Zealand, or the world recession that occurred. And some journalists came out to New Zealand and was asking people in the community, you know, how is the recession affecting you? And the people said, what recession? So for me, that meant that there is a perspective of where you look at it from. And for those in the community, they didn't know what they were missing until somebody told them they were missing it. So I think sometimes we've got to look at where we are in the community and how we really want to help that community, because maybe the answer is already in there. We just need to help them stretch it out a bit.
Yeah. And recognizing that, you know, if we can bring people to a much more even place, you know, where we have equal privilege to be together and to have, you know, our health needs met, you know, we will be far richer. You know, there's a real poverty in the, you know, wealthy society that we live in. We have, you know, worse homelessness, worse mental health, worse obesity. We've got, you know, many metrics that are actually worse, even though our economy is bigger, right? So I think, you know, being as clear as we can about what really defines a healthy community and focusing on that, that's part of the message that we're trying to get across.
Well, I haven't heard a single word from anyone challenging the idea of the need for degrowth. Surely there is someone out there
That's what we were preparing
who
for.
thinks it's a bad idea. No,
Yeah,
no,
we'd
seriously,
love to have some discussion on that.
seriously, we would like to hear any serious challenges to this position, because the mainstream obviously is quite negative about it. Dot, you would go ahead, unmute yourself.
I just want to quote my mainstream, well, he says he's not, doctor, who loves having a go at me because of my green principles. And when he heard about, he wanted to talk to me about the Greens tax policy and said, it's ridiculous. You need growth to have incentive. So there you are. That's one of the points. You need incentive to keep people learning and wanting to work. And if you have equality, they'll stop working.
So can I pick up the point from you, what you just said, is helping people who are in need, really helping them out long term? Certainly one of the things is their families need to be able to sustain themselves. But if you continuously feed them, they won't be able to do things for themselves. And it reminds me of a story. You can feed a person fish on a day, but if you teach them to fish, then they will be able to fish for themselves. And I think there's something in that about how do we move people from one part to another part, though they need to be able held up to a certain level.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the enablement, you know, that people can actually have a sense of agency. And Dot, you know, I would just have to say that your doctor sounds to me like he's got quite a cynical outlook on human nature if he thinks that competition and growth are really the incentives for motivating people. I think a sense of care and well-being are also equally powerful motivators. And I think, you know, that I was trying to emphasize that in one of my slides, that, you know, inequality isn't fixed by growth, it's fixed by care and redistribution. We have a growing economy, but we don't have improving qualitative measures. You know, as I said before, you know, we have problems that are getting worse despite growing.
Yeah.
So I would say that our motivation needs to go away from competition and individual success or profit, and we really, as a society, need to reevaluate what the priorities are.
Okay, Paul. Paul, did you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that inherited wealth is a huge determinant on how well people do. But there's lots of circumstances that put people in a bad position, which they find a great struggle to recover. Actually, I just discovered that the rental houses up behind our house, there's a young guy who lost absolutely everything in the fire in Wellington. And he was on the 4th floor, so he was really lucky to escape with his life. But he's got absolutely nothing, and he hasn't even got any identification. So he's in emergency accommodation now. But obviously those people with no savings and no insurance will be at the low end of our economy for quite some time.
And perhaps they're the ones who need the greatest supports.
Yeah. Just in closing, well, Brian Aberfield, do you want to raise your hand? Go ahead, Brian.
Tēnā koutou. Give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day. Teach him how to fish and he'll drive around on a boat drinking beer and pretending to fish all day. Yeah. So I think the point is, whoever, it's human nature and human attitudes, human inertia, human laziness, human inability to understand the exponential function. I can't see the 8 billion people of the planet catching on to the idea very quickly of degrowing. It's daunting, but yeah. But I think we can do what we can do personally, but I just look around in despair, to be honest. But
we share your despair, Brian. It's overwhelming. And yet, just think of those children who are being born now, and it is up to us to struggle and try to shift a paradigm. It is absolutely an enormous project, and yet it's what needs to happen. And I think, with time and the disruptions which will come, we will need to rethink how we do things.
Yeah. Well, I agree. I mean, water will wear away a stone, but there's not that much time, and the consequences are the only thing that are going to make people shift their behaviours, and obviously we're in the process now of coping the consequences. Coromandel Peninsula is down to one road.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
I think just recognizing as well that, with disruptions, there's the potential for conflict. Yeah, we need to work together.
Yeah. I was remiss in the opening to not acknowledge that this presentation has been a joint effort of both our climate declaration and DANZ. And I suspect we'll have more webinars on related topics to degrowth, because both organizations have been supporters. I think one of the founders of our climate declaration, Jeanette Fitzsimons, would have been very happy with this event this evening. And for those of you who are interested in these issues, you're not alone. It may seem like that in the sea of growth orientation around us, but there is a growing number of people who are concerned about these issues and actually wanting to do something, as Rawson is saying. let's get some action. So stay tuned. Take a look at both websites of our climate declaration and DANZ and see how you might fit in. And the one thing you can do tomorrow, and is talk to somebody about what you experienced tonight, and see if you can get more people aware of these issues and involved. Because that's the way it's going to happen. We can't, if it doesn't come from the community, it's not going to come from the politicians. So it's up to us. So Sarah, thanks very much for taking over tonight and doing such a great job. And there you get some hand claps and whatnot. And
Yeah.
I think people have greatly appreciated it.
Well,
So
thank you.
Thanks
Yeah,
one and
thank
all.
you,
And
everyone.
we hope to see you in future webinars and other events.
Thank
Good
you
night,
so
all.
much for joining, everyone, and for sharing in these conversations. It's essential and so important. So thank you for being here tonight.
Very good. And the presentation, the recording will be up on the various websites in the future if you wanted to pick up on some particular points relevant to it. Okay, all for now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.